welcome to the Faith Seeking Understanding podcast. I'm Roland, this is Matt, and we're busy going through Proverbs. So in the last episode, we just finished a 3-episode run talking about Proverbs 1 to 9, which is sort of the introduction or the preface to the book. And now we're starting to delve into the Proverbs themselves. And I think one of the things, or the main thing we want to get out of the next few episodes is to help you guys think about how to read the Proverbs as Christians, and have them impact your life. Because I think it can be quite tempting to read them and be like, cool, that's a thing that I read, and then move on with your life, right? But that's not how they were originally intended. And I think to some extent the fact that that's our natural response to them is an indication that we've moved away from the way that living life properly has been thought about by God's people.
Yeah.
And so our aim here is to sort of reorientate that, recenter it around the way it was intended to be read and understood and lived out. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So where would be a good place to start with that, I guess, is the relationship between Proverbs or wisdom more broadly and what we tend to call ethics or morality today.
Yeah.
Because I think it's fair to say that Christians want to be moral people, right? Because they think God is the source of morality, and they want to please Him, and so we want to live moral lives. But our thinking about the relationship between moral ideas like good and bad, good and evil, sinful, righteous, and wisdom and folly, I think is a bit confused these days. That fair?
I'd say so, yeah. We sort of put those into two different camps, I think. At least the way that we seem to talk about them most often. You've got ethics talking about right and wrong, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, the commands, the instructions. And you've got wisdom, the optional extras.
Yeah.
The weird in between.
Yeah. You often sometimes hear it about it, like if someone's giving you guidance on something, right? And they're trying to suggest what to do, but they don't want to say like, well, if you don't do what I say, then that's a sin.
Yeah.
So they say, this is not a sin issue, this is a wisdom issue.
It's a grey area.
It's a grey area.
Black and white.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think that's the black and white we tend to reserve. That's like where morality is on either end. And then the grey area in the middle is like, listen, you can go either way with this and it won't be a sin. And so we call that wisdom.
It sort of reminds me of those MasterCard adverts where you've got like this thing, $12. This thing, $14. This thing, $120. There's some things that, and then like the punchline is always, this thing, priceless. There's some things that money can't buy. For everything else, there's MasterCard. It seems like you've got, there's some things that are clear in the Bible. There are some things that are very clearly right and wrong. For everything else, there's matters of wisdom.
You're right.
It's the catch-all for things that aren't clearly... It's not obvious which way to go, so there probably isn't a right answer, and you can sort of do what seems like it's going to lead to the best results. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. So now, so I mean, you can kind of see where people are coming from with this distinction, right? Like you don't want to conflate like the intuitions of man with the instructions of God.
Right.
Right. And if there's no clear case, then it's like, well, it's going to involve interpretation, and so, yeah, we don't want to conflate those two things, and so we keep them as far apart as we possibly can.
Right.
I think the problem is that language of wisdom and folly, right, is it's tied up with listening to God and not listening to God. I mean, We've seen that a lot now in the discussion of 1 to 9. Like, wisdom means, well, it starts with fearing the Lord, right? It's the first fruits of it. And the main source of wisdom is God's instructions for how to live.
Yeah.
So if you're not doing that, then you're sinning.
Yeah.
It's like...
Yeah. It seems like a really simple move to make.
Yeah. Not to mention the fact that righteousness and wisdom are often connected with one another. I don't know if I can find an example of that. Do you have an example in Proverbs that talks about that?
Off the top of my head, I think chapter 10 or 11 has a few back-to-back. Ill-gotten treasures have no lasting value, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Which is all sort of given a slant. He goes on, but it's all sort of given a slant by the first verse there, that the wise son brings joy to his father, the foolish son brings grief to his mother. So there's this wisdom and folly, the good, the bad, and let's see how that plays out with a string of proverbs that seem to talk about righteousness and good and bad behavior, lazy and productive behavior, all of this sort of like quite closely intertwined.
Yeah, and if I go down to 10 verse 30 and 31, the righteous will never be removed, but the wicked will not dwell in the land. Now that might seem a bit of a weird thing to say. How does that talk about wisdom? But as we saw in chapter 2, the way that you stay in the land is by listening to wisdom.
Yeah.
Right? So he's just saying the same thing now, but he's using righteous in the place of wisdom and wickedness in the place of folly. And then the very next verse, the mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse in tongue will be cut off. So there's like a direct connection between the two.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a bit difficult to hold this distinction in hand. However, I think in rejecting this distinction between, okay, there's non-moral wisdom for the gray area and there's moral actions for the black and white areas, right? And okay, now we're saying no, that's not right. Wisdom and morality, they're the same. They're covering the same things. And they apply both in the black and white areas as well as the gray areas.
Yeah.
We do have to do, like, justice, I guess. We do have to do justice to the intuition that, like, it is more difficult in the gray areas than in the black and white areas. So, like, how do we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that this is going to seem like a little bit of a side route, but I think it's going to get to what we're talking about. In a previous episode, we spoke about Solomon's wisdom.
Yeah.
And how Solomon was incredibly wise in building a kingdom that was in diametric opposition to God's blueprint. That didn't stop being wisdom.
Yes,
and
that's a good point.
We had to acknowledge that actually wisdom is not inherently righteous. That wisdom can be oriented towards pursuing one's own ends. It's just, I guess, pursuing those ends very well. What we saw with Proverbs is that it's not completely ditching that idea, as if there's this whole other perspective here. What Proverbs is doing is it sets the agenda early on to say that in your pursuit of wisdom, make sure that it's Torah shaped. Make sure that its first fruits look like the fear of the Lord, and that it terminates in the sort of character that God wants to see cultivated in his people. Righteousness, justice, equity, which will in turn lead to long life in the land and the blessing that we would expect from a book like Deuteronomy. So when bringing this into the question of wisdom and ethics, with that as our starting point, I think it looks like doing right and wrong, doing righteousness, justice, and fairness well, pursuing those ends and that sort of character with wisdom means doing it skillfully. That, I think, is one way that we can start to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
That we're faced with life's complexities, that we're going to be given situations where, this explicit command seems to say one thing, this explicit command seems to say another thing, and actually what to do isn't clear. That doesn't mean that there isn't a right answer.
Yeah, that they aren't accountable to some extent. Yeah,
but that does mean that we've got some figuring out to do, and wisdom is going to help us do that.
Yeah, I think a big thing that kind of gets in the way with us thinking about this is that we want to put a label. So say we do something. So you're in a situation and you do something, right? And now we want to put that into a category. We want to put it into a box. Either you did a good thing or you did a bad thing. And if it's good, it's entirely good. And if it's bad, it's entirely bad.
Yeah.
And that works when you're thinking about morality in terms of black and white, right?
Yeah.
Because then that's what the black and white meets, right?
Yeah.
But when you're in the gray area, it's not that we throw out morality. It's that you have to nuance the way that you think about the good and bad in things. You have to realize that things can be a mixture of good and bad. Like, you can give some advice to your friend, and in the course of giving advice that's very uplifting, insult them accidentally, right?
Yeah.
Did you do a good or a bad thing? Yes. Right? You did both.
Yeah.
You helped them to see things in a new way, but you did so in a way that could be better, right? And so then wisdom is I like the idea of skill. Like, wisdom is saying, okay, well, I'm going to develop a skill set where in the beginning I'm probably going to suck. Like any skill, I'm probably going to suck, and it's going to be, but I'm going to be able to reflect on those cases that are a mixture of good and bad, and in the future do better with the proportion, right? I'm probably never going to get to, often the times you're never going to get to 100% good, just because of the complexities of life or the variety of circumstances you can find yourself in. They're not always going to be one-to-one.
Yeah.
But like, wisdom is you learning, you taking that Torah perspective, looking at how things worked out, and then iterating on that and saying, cool, I'm going to develop a better skill, so that by the time you get to like 30, 40, 50, you're finding that you're able to navigate those complicated things a lot more carefully, a lot more with, not stepping on any landmines or anything like that that are all over the place. And you can see this, I think, when you see someone who's really skillful, who's clearly good at things, like whether they're in a meeting at work, or particularly when they're breaking news to someone, or when they're dealing with very difficult things, like maybe a friend has lost a loved one, and it's like, well, how do I talk about it? And like in the beginning, you're like, well, I'll just say what would be helpful to me, right? But then over time, you realize people are quite different.
Yeah.
And so then the first thing that the wiser person does is they learn to figure out what kind of person they're talking to, so that they can help them in the way that suits them the best.
Yeah.
Now, does the person who is doing that in the beginning, taking care of their friend, like, are they doing something bad? Well, yes, if they're hurting their feelings a lot in the course of doing it, but yes, to the extent that they're hurting their feelings.
Yeah.
But no,
the intention is good.
Yes, but no, to the extent that they are still making some kind of help, and they, their friend is able to recognize that there's someone there that cares about them and wants to hear their pain and so on like that. So I think there's it's a tricky thing, but I think the idea of morality can't be applied to the gray areas because we can't label things as entirely good or entirely bad. It's like you've kind of lost the point there, right?
Yeah. One of the things I think this means is that right and wrong, or how we think about ethics, is a hang of a lot more pervasive than I think we're used to talking about. When we talk about ethics, I think it's very easy for us to latch onto the big topics.
Yeah.
Murder, lying, adultery, the sorts of things that we find in the Ten Commandments, or the things that we'd find in the law.
The difficult ethical decisions that are few and far between in life. The
sort of things that we can legislate on with some reasonable degree of effectiveness. You can't legislate on every bit of the minutiae of life, but there's some things that we can say, well, no, that's wrong, and so there's a sort of attachment to it that, no, if you do that, then this is what happens to you. But if we're saying that, no, right and wrong, or the extent to which we can think of something in terms of ethics or right and wrong is also encompasses the various stages along the way in terms of wisdom and how well we're doing it, well, actually that means that there's a lot more to be taken into account.
Right. Yeah, totally. It's your day-to-day decisions, your everyday decisions that, sure. There's a lot that can go into that, right? And I think as you're pointing out, that's pretty much what Proverbs covers.
Yeah.
It does every now and then cover big things. I see here, a false balance is the abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. That's pretty easy, right? You gave the guy the right amount of change, or like, you valued their item correctly, or you don't. Okay, cool. Black and white. I get it. That makes sense. But like, there's plenty of other decisions you make during your life. Like, how do I spend my free time? Like, where do I go to my friend's house?
Is procrastination a sin?
Is procrastination a sin? Yeah.
I mean, that's a favorite for me, because the amount of times that in the course of an average week, particularly when I was studying, the amount of times I would hear in the course of an average week somebody parading their procrastination like it was an Olympic sport.
Right.
Like, I need to start this assignment, but I'm procrastinating so hard. You're wearing that like a badge of honor, man.
Yeah. I feel like your emotions are wrong. Like, you gotta feel a different thing there. Yeah. It also affects, like, it's not just the decisions, right? Because as we've been saying, if wisdom is a skill, and wisdom is a factor in morality, then it's an important thing about how do you develop that skill. So a decision can be good or bad, not necessarily because it has a direct influence, but it could have an indirect influence on the way that your character it builds your character.
Yeah.
It influences. I mean, we discussed this before we were in the podcast. We discussed this a bit, but like, it influences the kinds of friends you surround yourself with. If you're the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with, then like,
there's a proverb about that.
Oh yeah.
I just saw it earlier before we hit the record button. Oh, it's here in front of me. As water reflects the face, so one's life reflects the heart.
Okay.
So, I mean, in fact, depending on how you translate that, the NIV actually has a footnote that if my virtual Bible also has footnotes.
Yep.
As water reflects the face, so others reflect your heart back to you. I mean, depending on how you carve that up in the Hebrew, that's quite telling.
That's right. I mean, either way, right? Because your heart isn't just this or that action. It's your character. And your character doesn't get formed in a day. It's not like a movie where there's one moment that defines who you are for the rest of the movie kind of thing, right? It's the sum of all the tiny choices you make throughout the day.
Yeah.
And so either way, it's the relationship between your friends or the relationship between your past actions. Like, yeah.
There's actually in either case, there's still that inner self that will show itself in, the course of one's life, and that also needs to be cultivated. I mean, Proverbs also speaks to some of the more, I guess, trivial things. So we could, that we might think of that, again, don't sound like they should be in a conversation about ethics.
Yeah.
So Proverbs 25:17, seldom set foot in your neighbor's house. Too much of you, and they will hate you. I mean, is that not the truest thing you've ever heard?
Yeah.
But like, you wouldn't necessarily think of that in the way that we usually talk about morality. You wouldn't necessarily think of that as a moral issue.
Mm-hmm.
But it speaks to the way that we treat each other and sensitivity towards having somebody else in your space and how that might make you feel. Or
I think what's difficult about that from the sort of, what we call it, the modern moral standpoint, if we will, the black and white moral standpoint, is that it doesn't resolve down to an individual action, right? Like, the number of times I see my friend in a week isn't a choice I make. Like, it isn't an individual choice. It's sort of like accumulation of like, oh, I want to have fun. I like person X. Let me go hang out at person X's house.
Yeah,
that's not bad. That's a good thing to say. But it's like, it's being aware that they could get sick of you, or like you could become a burden to them, or there's a whole bunch of other things that can be at play there that you need to factor into the life of your friendship, if you will.
Yeah.
We have another one here, which is pretty obvious. So like 10 verse 4, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. It's like, work hard and you'll get rewarded, and don't work hard and you won't get rewarded.
Yep.
And that's not always the case, unfortunately. But like, as a general principle,
Proverbs on promises.
Yeah. I like that. That's a nice saying.
That's a proverb.
Is it really?
No.
Oh. That would have been a great way to start Proverbs.
Yeah.
The Proverbs of Solomon. Proverbs aren't promises. Let me just get that out the way.
Make that disclaimer.
Yeah.
Although, can you imagine how many people would be like, well, okay, then I'm not reading this one.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, Proverbs aren't promises, but that actually tends to hold.
Yeah.
If you put in the effort, generally you'll see the results. If you don't, you probably won't.
But then, so let's take that one as an example. How do you think about that in terms of morality? In terms of ethics?
I mean, that sounds like my procrastination comment earlier.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Actually, if you procrastinate, well, what are you doing there? That sounds like a pretty slack hand.
I think there's an interesting aspect here that comes up if you think about this in terms of the categories of wisdom and folly that we were talking about before, right? So, I mean, from 1 to 9, because if you break it up into like the wisdom side and the folly side, right? The idea of wisdom is you'll do these things and they'll sometimes be hard, but the benefits will bear fruit. And then in the case of folly, it's like there's an initially appealing idea, but ultimately they'll lead you to death. Okay, now those are very extreme ways of saying things that can in general be true, right? So in this case, the one side of this, I mean, the slack hand causes poverty. Okay, that's on the full side, right? Like if you're not doing, the slack hand doesn't just mean you're not doing anything. It probably means you're doing things other than work.
Yeah.
Right? You're playing an excessive amount of video games. I'm probably guilty of that. You're spending too much time just partying and or I don't know, doing things that are fun but not necessarily productive, whatever, right? Or not able to contribute to your well-being.
Yeah.
Whereas the diligent makes rich. That's clearly on the wisdom side, where it's initially doesn't seem like a very fun thing, but it does then open up options and enable a more fulfilled life, that you're able to support others, you're able to benefit in further richer things that don't have access to if you don't do that.
It seems to me that with things like discipline, with things like hard work, there's that initial hump that you need to get over. There's the flinch that you need to overcome. That once you're over the hump, actually things tend to get easier.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a gold mine of this in the self-help world, where you've got things like the Pomodoro technique or a whole lot of different things.
Pomodoro technique.
Yeah, but things to help to get you over that initial hump. That if you set the timer and it's like, oh, I'm going to work for 25 minutes, I can do that. Or breaking your work down into sections, being like, okay, well, I can't write 3,000 words of essay today, but I could write 250. That doesn't sound so bad. Helps to get over the hump. But I guess linking up with something we were just talking about a moment ago, that over time, actually, that it's more than just the event of doing the work that is of worth. It's the character that's cultivated along the way, that the more diligent you are and the more you practice that, the more diligent you'll become, and the easier it will be to become I guess continue along that trend, as opposed to the person who struggles to get out of bed. Well, the longer you stay in bed, the harder it's going to be to get out of bed.
It's habit formation.
Yeah,
that's just it, right? We don't think of habit. We think of habits as like tics or part of our personality.
Yeah.
But and that sometimes is the case, right? Like, oh, I like to eat this kind of chocolate or that kind of chocolate. Fine.
Sure.
Okay, you do you. But then I think the key thing we learn from virtue ethics is that many habits can actually make a good character or a bad character. And those are called virtues and vices. And habit formation is very different from once in a few years difficult moral decision you have to make. It's a constant building something up or grinding something down. And and what's interesting, what I thought about there is like you develop a habit in one area of your life and then it impacts other areas of your life, right? So if I think of the slack hand causes poverty. I'm not quite in that hand, but if I think about slack hands, to me, I have to constantly make a decision like, okay, do I continue playing the game that I'm playing now? Because I play video games quite a lot. Do I continue playing the video game I'm playing now? Or do I go and clean up a part of the house? Or do I go and work on that project that I wanted to be working on? Or do I, X, Y, and Z?
Yeah. And
like every day I am given that choice, that decision to make. And every day, if I keep making the one choice, like it's going to be easier to make that choice over and over and over again. And then in our case, great talking about the if I keep putting off the thing that I should be doing, right? I mean, it feeds totally into my not getting up out of bed in the morning, right? Even though I'm not like I'm making a decision on the game thing, but it's the same idea. I'm putting off what I should be doing, getting up and getting ready because Matt's going to be here in like 20 minutes, and I'm never ready when he's here. Matt and I live in different time zones, apparently. But yeah, and so you start to see these connections between these different aspects of your life that are all grounded in the same habit that you can feed in all these different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that playing video games is a bad thing.
Yes.
That's not to say that sleeping in is necessarily a bad thing. But this is exactly the sort of complexity that we're talking about, and the need for wisdom that we need in thinking about the way that we order our lives. That taking a break to play some video games actually could be a very constructive thing.
Yeah.
Because we can't work all the time. We'll just wear ourselves down.
Completely, yeah.
But if we then only play video games or play too much, then it's finding that sort of balance. I guess same thing with sleep. That actually, yeah, we live in completely different time zones. The fact that you're a night owl and I'm an early bird, does that matter? No.
Yeah,
it's what works for us. And in fact, I heard something recently. I haven't fact checked this, so take this with a pinch of salt. But I heard that actually part of that is genetic. That if you're genetically wired to be an early bird, that's you. And you got people who are just not wired that way, and they can push. They can set all the alarms. They can drink all the coffee. They can do all the things to try and make themselves get up early. They're not going to be able to do it in any sort of convincing way because they're just not wired that way. And being in touch with your body's rhythms and listening to your body actually sounds like a very positive thing.
Yeah.
So recognizing that there's difference, that wisdom, discipline, productiveness doesn't look like the just do it 5 a.m. start, $1 million morning, whatever, that all the self-help books want to recommend. Actually, it looks like paying attention to the sort of balance that will lead to forming the right sort of habits.
This reminds what you said there, because it's a function of your circumstance, it's a function of where you are.
It's a very relative thing.
Very relative thing, yeah. Even though there's like directions that are good for you to go in, and that's true of everyone, where exactly you land will be relative to a whole bunch of factors that, yeah. And it reminds me of this example from Aristotle where he's talking about courage. So he says, courage is this mean between foolhardiness and cowardice, right? So either you just go for the dangerous thing and you don't think about it, you're an idiot and you're foolhardy, or you're just terrified of the thing and that prevents you from overcoming it and achieving good things. And he's like, well, courage looks like what courage actually looks like will be very different for like a wrestler and a scrawny person, right? Like if you just think of it in the case of a mugging or something, right? Or someone wants to like threaten you or something. Yeah. Like, well, if you're a professional wrestler, you could probably push back a lot more. Yeah, but if you're a scrawny guy, don't fight back. He's gonna beat you up. Like, give him your money. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and there's a different. Yeah, that was a really interesting example he gave where I was like, oh yeah, that's true. Like it's more complicated than one size fits all, which is again a trap we fall into if we think about morality in terms of black and white. We want to say one size fits all. Yeah, this is what courage looks like for everybody. There's another example that on the face of it looks like a very straightforward, well, obviously don't do the thing. Yeah. But upon a bit of, with a bit more reflection, I think we can see that actually there's a bit more going on. So Proverbs 26:18-19, like a maniac shooting flaming arrows of death is one who deceives their neighbor and says, I was only joking. Wow. Read that again. Like a maniac shooting flaming arrows of death is one who deceives their neighbor and says, I was only joking. Bro, is he gaslighting his neighbor? Is that what's happening there? Well, I mean, you can think of so many examples of this where somebody's like, I don't know, they say something and they just backtrack. No, I was only joking. Yeah, totally. They insult you and they're like, no, I was only joking. Yeah, they realize that they've gone too far. And rather than own it and acknowledge the mistake and grow from it, they're just like, no, they're afraid to own it. And I wasn't being serious. Yeah, yeah. Wow, it's such a hectic image though. But I mean, flaming arrows of death, love it. I know somebody who
made their kid memorize this proverb. I was just like, yeah, okay. But actually, more people should do that.
It's true, isn't it? Because if, like, you actually double down on the hurt that you give to someone if you do that, right?
Yeah.
So you hurt them initially with the flaming arrows, and then you say, "Oh, I'm only joking." So then now you're making them feel like they were just being too sensitive,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas,
They
like,
couldn't take a joke.
yeah,
They weren't
whereas
perceptive enough to see the humor.
100%, yeah. Whereas if you think about how different it would be if you owned up to it and was like, "Oh no, I'm sorry, like that was uncalled for,"
I crossed the line there.
then like you're owning some of the pain. Okay, great, and then also you're showing that you respect them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's crazy to think about that, and that's a small thing, isn't it? I mean, friends joke between themselves all the time, and like you're bound to cross the line somewhere, right? Like it's gonna happen.
And I guess that's part of the relative nature of it, that this verse is not saying that joking is bad.
Yes.
Humor is fine. And there's a level at which we can sort of take a dig at each other and it can be okay.
Yeah.
That a level where it doesn't cross a line, and that's completely fine. But then again, the being real to, you know, own up to it when you have crossed the line. Or to better have the perceptiveness or the wherewithal to know not to cross the line to begin with.
Yes.
To know, okay, well, jokes up until this point, and I don't make that extra comment. I don't make you the butt of that joke. I don't say it in front of those people, whatever the situation demands.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, yeah, man. And like the thing is, it's interesting because I think we know this,
Yeah,
to some extent, right? Like you know that even though it's not black and white, like you can really hurt your friend's feelings if you do this thing, and like if you do that repeatedly, like you're just not a good person. Like, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. So okay, so let's tie this up a little bit here. So we're saying morality is, well, the reason that we struggle to read Proverbs with an ethical lens, with a way for it to influence our lives, is because we tend to think about morality these days in terms of black and white, and Proverbs are very much living in the grey.
Right. Yeah. And possibly even take that further. The reason that we don't tend to pay attention to Proverbs is because in trying to think about what it looks like to live uprightly as God's people, these just seem too general to mean enough.
Yes. Okay. But if we broaden our horizons a bit, if we let the biblical text speak for itself, and we recognize that wisdom isn't speaking to a non-moral class of action, it's just envisaging a much broader vision of morality than what we are prone to think of these days, then we can see that it speaks to things, but then we also need to change the way that we approach ethics, right? So instead of thinking about this or that action, we think about, well, how do the small choices in our life contribute to our character? Instead of waiting for a big, obvious moral decision, we take a constant check of our character and be like, am I growing in the habits that I think are good or bad, right? Like, you don't have to do that every decision, but it's like, well, am I just not being very nice to my friends? Am I like, or am I, is it okay that I'm waking up this late? Like, should I be working on those things and reflecting on those things? And then once we're in that kind of mindset, then coming to Proverbs and having it speak to us in terms of the categories of wisdom and folly that it's already set up, and then looking at these mundane things, it can help us in that reflection and that meditation. So,
yeah, no, I think so. So we can come to this book and we should come to this book and really soak it in, because it speaks to, and because it'll help us to think about those sort of mundane areas of life that matter a hang of a lot more than we might initially suppose.
Great. I think we're going to end it there. Leave it there. So we're going to continue going through these. I'm not sure. We're not entirely sure how we're going to go through them yet.
Yeah. Well, in future episodes, as we kind of walk through here, there'll be a few ways that we'll come at this. But what we're really wanting to do is just, with that grounding in place, to say that this matters for how we live and that we need to pay attention to this. Okay. Well, then how do we read it effectively for it to have the most impact on shaping us as moral agents?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's worth pointing
How
out
do
that
we read this?
yeah, our point is, our aim here is not to go through everything. We're going to give you the tools that enable you to read these yourself. So
Yeah.
as you, I think we'll try our best, but we'll encourage you to keep reading the Proverbs. Sit down one day a week and just read 2 chapters of the Proverbs, or just pick a proverb out too, and just think about the ways that it could be general and generalized, and how it could speak to your character, even if it's not directly, the exact concrete circumstances isn't directly applicable to you right now.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's where we're going to end it. Thanks for listening to the episode. Again, if you're listening on any of the platforms, you can subscribe to the podcast. We'd really appreciate it.
If you're on YouTube, hit that notification bell so you know when we upload a new episode. And if you're listening on any other podcast platform, it would really help to give us a good rating, and it would help other people find out about it. And we'll see you in the next one.